Commander Zekthar stood before the memorial wall in the Galactic Defense Academy, his 6 eyes scanning the names etched in crystalline panels. Each name represented a fallen warrior from across the galaxy, but one section drew his attention like a magnetic pull, the human section, even after 20 cycles since the war ended. The memories of fighting alongside those strange bipedal creatures still haunted his dreams. The young cadets gathered around him, their various species creating a colorful assembly of scales, fur, and chitinous armor. They had come to hear the old war stories, expecting tales of glory and heroism. Zekthar's mandibles clicked nervously as he prepared to share something far more complex than simple battlefield victories. "You want to know about humans?" he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Everyone thinks they understand what made them special. The propaganda vids show their technology, their ships, their weapons, but that's not what made them terrifying to our enemies or invaluable as our allies." A young Krathari cadet raised her scaled hand. "Commander, the archives say humans were physically inferior to most warrior races. How did they become such effective soldiers?" Zekthar's memory drifted back to his first encounter with humans during the siege of Kepler 442b. He had been a junior officer then, assigned to a mixed-species assault unit. The human contingent had arrived in battered ships, their equipment clearly salvaged and repaired multiple times. His initial assessment had been dismissive. These soft-skinned creatures with their small frames and single pair of eyes seemed laughably inadequate for warfare. "I thought the same thing," Zekthar admitted to the cadets. "When Captain Sarah Chen introduced herself to our unit, I wondered if the Alliance had sent us civilian contractors by mistake. She barely reached my shoulder, carried a weapon that looked ancient compared to our plasma rifles, and had this peculiar habit of making jokes during mission briefings." The memory sharpened as he recalled the pre-battle atmosphere. The other species had approached the coming fight with professional detachment or ritualistic preparation. The Krathari performed their war chants. The Vorthak meditated in silence, and his own people, the Zilani, conducted technical equipment checks with methodical precision. The humans, however, had done something entirely different. They gathered in small groups and talked, Zekthar continued. Not about tactics or glory, but about home. They showed pictures of their families, shared food that smelled strange but somehow comforting, and told stories that made them laugh even as we prepared for battle. I couldn't understand how they could be so casual about the possibility of death. The battle itself had been a revelation. The enemy forces, a savage species called the Devourers, had overwhelmed the outer defenses faster than anyone anticipated. Zekthar's unit found themselves cut off from the main force, trapped in a collapsed building with dwindling ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. "That's when I first saw what humans were truly capable of," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "When our situation became hopeless, when every tactical manual said we should surrender or find a defensive position to die with honor, the humans did something unexpected. They started planning a rescue mission." The young cadets leaned forward, their attention completely captured. Zekthar remembered the shock he had felt when Captain Chen had calmly announced that they were going to attempt to reach a group of wounded soldiers trapped 3 buildings over. The tactical situation made such a mission suicide, but the humans had simply nodded and begun preparing. Captain Chen asked for volunteers. Zekthar continued. Every single human stepped forward without hesitation. But more surprising was that they expected the rest of us to do the same. Not ordered us, not commanded us, but assumed we would risk our lives for soldiers we barely knew, from a completely different species. The rescue attempt had been a masterclass in human warfare psychology. While other species fought with discipline, honor, or biological imperative, humans fought with something more dangerous: purpose. They moved through enemy territory not with the mechanical precision of his own people, or the savage fury of warrior races, but with a terrifying combination of intelligence, adaptability, and absolute refusal to abandon their mission. I watched Private Rodriguez take 3 plasma burns to his chest and keep advancing because a wounded Krathari was calling for help, Zekthar said, his voice thick with emotion. I saw Sergeant Williams hold off an entire Devourer pack with nothing but a damaged rifle and improvised explosives, buying time for the rest of us to evacuate civilians. These weren't superhuman feats of strength or speed. They were choices. The young cadet sat in stunned silence as Zekthar described how the humans had turned a hopeless tactical situation into a successful rescue operation through sheer determination and creative problem-solving. They had used abandoned civilian vehicles as mobile cover, turned building debris into improvised weapons, and somehow convinced soldiers from 6 different species to follow their increasingly desperate plans. But the most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their courage, Zekthar said, his 6 eyes focusing on each cadet in turn. It was their memory. After the battle, as we counted our dead and celebrated our survival, I expected the humans to move on like the rest of us. Instead, they remembered everything. Every name, every sacrifice, every moment of fear or pain, they carried it all with them. He gestured toward the memorial wall behind him. Captain Chen died in the final assault on the Devourer homeworld, along with most of her unit. But before she died, she made me promise something. She made me promise to remember not just the victories but the cost. To remember that war isn't about glory or honor or tactical superiority. It's about the choices we make when everything else is stripped away. The cadets remained silent, processing the weight of his words. Zekthar turned back to the memorial wall, his gaze settling on the human section once more. Each name represented not just a death but a choice to stand when running was safer, to fight when surrender was logical, to hope when despair was reasonable. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the Battle of Proxima Station, he said quietly, about how a single human medic held a field hospital against overwhelming odds, and what I learned about the difference between bravery and humanity. But tonight I want you to think about this. In all my years of warfare, across dozens of species and hundreds of battles, I've never met anyone who fought harder to preserve life than the humans did, to preserve death's meaning. The next morning, Commander Zekthar found the cadets waiting for him in the Academy's tactical simulation room. Word had spread about his human war stories, and the group had nearly doubled in size. Representatives from 12 different species sat in the amphitheater-style seating. Their various forms of attention focused entirely on him. The Battle of Proxima Station, Zekthar began, activating the holographic display that showed the massive orbital medical facility. This was supposed to be a simple evacuation. The Devourers had broken through our outer defenses, and High Command had ordered all non-essential personnel to withdraw to safer sectors. The hologram rotated slowly, showing the station's vulnerable position at the edge of contested space. Its massive medical bays and research facilities made it a tempting target for the enemy, but also made it nearly impossible to evacuate quickly. Dr. Elena Vasquez was in charge of the medical staff, Zekthar continued, his memory bringing her face into sharp focus. She had been a small woman, even by human standards, with graying hair and hands that moved with surgical precision. When the evacuation order came, she had over 3,000 patients in various stages of treatment. Wounded soldiers from a dozen species, civilians caught in combat zones, and refugees from planets that had already fallen. A young Vorthak cadet raised his arm. "Commander, surely the protocols demanded patient evacuation before medical staff." Zekthar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. That's exactly what Dr. Vasquez said when I delivered the evacuation order. She looked at me with these incredibly calm eyes and said, "Commander, you're welcome to evacuate whoever you can fit on your transports. But I'm not leaving until every patient who can be moved has been moved." The holographic display shifted to show the interior of the medical facility. Rows upon rows of beds filled massive chambers, each occupied by beings from across the galaxy. The variety was staggering. Crystalline Thesari, whose mineral-based bodies required specialized atmospheric processors, aquatic benthri and mobile life support tanks,
and dozens of other species with incompatible biological needs. The logistics were impossible, Zekthar explained.
Each species required different environmental conditions, different medical equipment, different evacuation procedures. Our transport ships were designed for quick troop movement, not complex medical evacuations. A proper evacuation would have taken weeks. We had hours. He remembered the meeting in Dr. Vasquez's office, surrounded by medical staff from various species. The human doctor had spread tactical displays across her desk, treating the evacuation like a complex surgical procedure. While other medical officers had argued about protocols and procedures, she had simply started making lists. Dr. Vasquez divided the patients into groups, Zekthar continued, not by species or medical priority, but by transportation requirements. She figured out how to modify cargo holds into temporary medical bays, how to jury-rig life support systems for multiple species, and how to turn civilian shuttles into ambulances. The hologram showed the frantic activity that had followed. Human medical staff had worked alongside their alien colleagues, adapting equipment with an ingenuity that had impressed even Zekthar's technically minded people. They had turned maintenance tunnels into evacuation routes and converted storage areas into temporary treatment facilities. But then the Devourers arrived early, Zekthar said, his voice growing somber. 3 hours ahead of schedule in force. Our escort fleet was overwhelmed in minutes. The station's shields wouldn't hold for long, and we were still only halfway through the evacuation. The young cadets leaned forward as the holographic display showed enemy ships surrounding the medical station. The tactical situation had been hopeless, a massive, slow-moving target with minimal defenses against a fleet designed for destruction. That's when Dr. Vasquez made a decision that still gives me nightmares, Zekthar said. She ordered all remaining evacuation ships to depart immediately, fully loaded. Then she sealed the station's docking bays and activated the emergency medical protocols. A Krithari cadet spoke up, confusion evident in her scaled features. She trapped herself inside? Not just herself, Zekthar replied. She trapped herself along with nearly 400 patients who couldn't be moved safely, and about 60 medical staff who had volunteered to stay. The Devourer's reputation for treating medical facilities made it clear what would happen when they boarded the station. The memory of that moment still burned in Zekthar's mind. He had been on the last evacuation transport, watching through the viewport as the station's lights dimmed to emergency power. Dr. Vasquez had appeared on the communication screen one final time, her face composed despite the impossible situation. She asked me to record a message for the families of her staff. Zekthar continued. Not a goodbye, not a final testament, but medical reports. She wanted to make sure that the treatment protocols they had developed for cross-species medicine would survive even if they didn't. The Devourer assault on the station had been brutal and swift. The enemy had breached the hull in dozens of places, their savage warriors pouring through the corridors like a living wave of destruction. Standard protocol would have been to surrender or die fighting, but Dr. Vasquez had chosen a third option. She turned the medical station into a fortress, Zekthar said, his voice filled with admiration, using surgical equipment as weapons, medical gases as area denial tools, and her knowledge of the station's systems to create choke points and defensive positions. But most importantly, she kept treating patients. The holographic display showed the layout of the station's medical bay, where Dr. Vasquez and her staff had created their final stand. They had moved all remaining patients to the central treatment facility, a heavily reinforced area designed to withstand decompression events. For 18 hours, they held that position, Zekthar continued. The Devourers would assault the medical bay, and Dr. Vasquez would repel them using improvised defenses and guerrilla tactics. Then during the lulls between attacks, she would return to treating patients as if nothing had happened. The young cadets sat in stunned silence as Zekthar described the impossible scene. Human medical staff had continued performing surgery while under siege, adapting their procedures to work around combat conditions. They had maintained life support systems for multiple species, while using those same systems as weapons against their attackers. The rescue fleet arrived just as the station's power was failing, Zekthar said. When we boarded the medical bay, we found Dr. Vasquez still working. She had successfully treated and stabilized over 200 patients under combat conditions, including several who had been wounded during the siege itself. A young Zelani cadet spoke up, his voice filled with confusion. But Commander, how did she maintain her effectiveness under such stress? Our psychological profiles indicate that medical precision deteriorates rapidly under combat conditions. Zekthar's 6 eyes focused on the young officer. That's what I asked her after we evacuated the survivors. She was in her own medical bay, being treated for plasma burns and exhaustion, and I couldn't understand how she had functioned at all, let alone maintained her medical skills. The memory of Dr. Vasquez's response still resonated with him. She had looked up from her hospital bed, her hands still shaking from stress and stimulants, and given him an answer that had redefined his understanding of human psychology. She said, "Commander, when you're responsible for lives, fear becomes a luxury you can't afford. The patients needed me to be a doctor, so I was a doctor. Everything else was just noise." Zekthar turned to face the memorial wall visible through the simulation room's viewport. Dr. Vasquez survived the war and went on to establish the Galactic Medical Corps. She trained thousands of medical officers from dozens of species. But whenever anyone asks her about her greatest achievement, she always gives the same answer: The commander paused, letting the weight of his next words settle over the assembled cadets. She says her greatest achievement was learning that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to do what needs to be done anyway. The humans didn't fight because they weren't scared. They fought because being scared didn't matter more than the mission. 3 days later, Zekthar stood in the Academy's memorial garden, surrounded by an even larger group of cadets. News of his human stories had spread throughout the facility, and officers from the active fleet had begun attending his informal sessions. Today, a group of veteran instructors sat among the young cadets, their scarred faces and prosthetic limbs testament to their own combat experience. The siege of New Damascus, Zekthar began, his voice carrying across the quiet garden. 7 months into the war, the Devourers had surrounded the human colony world. 2 million civilians, mostly families of human soldiers serving in the fleet, trapped on a planet with minimal defenses. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the crystalline trees as Zekthar activated a portable holographic projector. The three-dimensional image showed a blue-green world surrounded by the dark shapes of enemy vessels, their predatory forms blocking any hope of escape. High Command had written off the planet, he continued. The tactical assessment was clear. Any rescue attempt would cost more ships and lives than could be saved. The logical decision was to evacuate what personnel we could and leave the civilians to their fate. A veteran Krathari instructor, her scales bearing the scars of old plasma burns, interrupted. Commander, the records show that Human Fleet Command disagreed with that assessment. Zekthar's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. Admiral Marcus Webb didn't just disagree. He defied direct orders from the Galactic Council. When the official rescue mission was cancelled, he declared the entire human defense fleet to be on extended maneuvers and disappeared into the outer systems. The holographic display shifted to show the massive human fleet that had assembled in secret. Unlike the sleek, purpose-built warships of other species, the human vessels looked like they had been cobbled together from salvage and determination. Converted cargo haulers bristled with hastily mounted weapons. Civilian transports had been armored with whatever materials could be found, and ancient destroyers that should have been retired decades ago formed the backbone of the assault force. I was serving as a tactical advisor on the Galactic Council's monitoring station, Zekthar said. We detected the human fleet 3 days before they reached New Damascus. Every strategic computer we had predicted total annihilation. They were outnumbered 3-1, outgunned, and attacking a prepared defensive position. The memory of that day still filled him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The humans had approached the siege zone with all the subtlety of a solar flare, broadcasting their intentions on every frequency, while their mismatched, fleet-formed battle lines that defied every principle of naval tactics. Admiral Webb opened. Communications with the Devourer Fleet Commander, Zekthar continued. Not to negotiate or surrender, but to make a simple statement. He said, You have exactly 1 hour to begin evacuating the planet. After that, we're coming through you. The assembled cadets and instructors listened in fascination as Zekthar described the psychological warfare that had followed. Instead of maintaining communication silence before the attack, the human fleet had flooded all frequencies with transmissions. Music, personal messages to the trapped civilians. Tactical chatter that seemed designed to be overheard, and most disturbing of all, detailed descriptions of what they planned to do to any devourer who harmed the civilians. The devourers had never encountered anything like it, Zekthar explained. Other species fought with honor codes, tactical doctrines, or biological imperatives. But humans fought with something that translated poorly to other languages: spite. They weren't just willing to die for those civilians. They were eager to take as many enemies with them as possible. The holographic display showed the opening moments of the battle. The human fleet had charged directly at the Devourer blockade, their ships taking devastating damage but refusing to break formation. What should have been a massacre had turned into something far more complex. The humans had done something unprecedented, Zekthar said. They had turned their entire fleet into guided missiles. Every ship was rigged with overloaded reactors programmed to detonate if disabled. The Devourers couldn't simply destroy them. Every human ship that died took enemy vessels with it. A young Vorthak cadet raised his hand. Commander, that sounds like a suicide mission. How could they maintain morale under those conditions? Zekthar's memory provided the answer in the form of intercepted human communications during the battle. Instead of grim acceptance of death, the human crews had maintained an almost cheerful demeanor, joking with each other as they flew toward certain destruction. Captain Jennifer Hayes, commanding the converted freighter, Determination, broadcast her final message as her ship's hull began to buckle under enemy fire, Zekthar said. She said, "Hey, Admiral, looks like I'm going to be a little late for the victory party. Save me some cake." The battle had been chaos unlike anything Zekthar had ever witnessed. Human ships had rammed Devourer vessels when their weapons failed, detonated their cargo holds to create impromptu mines, and, in one memorable case, used their artificial gravity generators to create weapon effects that no military manual had ever described. But the most remarkable thing wasn't their willingness to die, Zekthar continued. It was their absolute refusal to let anyone else die unnecessarily. Even as their ships were being destroyed, human crews continued rescue operations, picking up survivors from other vessels and somehow finding room for them on ships that were already overcrowded. The tide of battle had turned when the human fleet had managed to punch through the Devourer blockade, but instead of establishing orbital control and beginning evacuation procedures, they had done something that had left even Zekthar speechless. Admiral Webb divided his remaining ships into two groups, Zekthar explained. Half began immediate evacuation of the civilian population. The other half started hunting down every single Devourer ship in the system, refusing to let any escape to report on human tactics or carry word of the colony's location to other enemy fleets. The evacuation itself had been a masterpiece of improvisation and logistics. Human ships had reconfigured their interiors in real time, turning weapon bays into passenger compartments and stripping non-essential systems to make room for life support equipment. Civilian transports had made multiple trips through combat zones, their crews volunteering for missions that had survival rates measured in single digits. I watched a human cargo pilot named Rodriguez make 7 trips through active combat to evacuate a refugee camp, Zekthar said. His ship was so damaged by the end that it was held together by emergency patches and determination, but he kept flying because there were still people on the ground. The final phase of the battle had been the most brutal. The remaining Devourer forces had attempted to reach the planet's surface, planning to use the civilians as hostages. The human response had been swift and merciless. Admiral Webb personally led the assault on the Devourer landing forces, Zekthar said. Flying a damaged fighter with failing life support, he coordinated a ground attack that saved the remaining civilians while simultaneously managing the orbital evacuation. When his ship finally gave out, he continued directing operations from a crashed fighter cockpit until the last transport cleared the atmosphere. A veteran Zelani instructor spoke up, his mechanical arm whirring as he gestured. "Commander, the strategic significance of New Damascus extended beyond the civilians saved." How did this action affect the broader war? Zekthar's 6 eyes focused on the instructor. The tactical data from that battle changed everything. The humans had proven that conventional naval doctrine was useless against an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for victory. But more importantly, they had shown the galaxy something that the Devourers had never encountered before. The holographic display shifted to show intelligence reports and tactical analyses that had flooded Galactic Command in the aftermath of the battle. Every military strategist had tried to understand how the humans had achieved the impossible, but they had all missed the crucial point. The other species saw the human victory as a tactical innovation. Zekthar continued. New weapons, new strategies, new ways of thinking about space combat. But the Devourers understood what had really happened. They had encountered an enemy that valued the lives of others more than their own survival. The psychological impact on the Devourer war machine had been devastating. A species that relied on fear and overwhelming force had discovered an opponent that became more dangerous as the situation became more hopeless. Human resistance had stiffened with each atrocity, rather than crumbling as expected. Admiral Webb survived the war and went on to redesign our entire approach to fleet tactics, Zekthar said. But when the victory celebrations were held, he didn't attend. I found him in the cemetery on New Damascus, placing flowers on the graves of the crew members who had died in the evacuation. The commander paused, letting his words settle over the assembled group. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting the memorial garden in golden light that made the crystalline trees seem to glow from within. A week had passed since Zekthar began his informal storytelling sessions, and the Academy's largest auditorium was now packed beyond capacity. Officers from across the galaxy had requested leave to attend, creating an unprecedented gathering of military personnel representing over 30 species. Today, Fleet Admiral Thorne herself sat in the front row, her insignia marking her as one of the highest-ranking officers in the Galactic Defense Force. "The Battle of the Void Rift," Zekthar announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive space. The turning point of the war, though none of us realized it at the time. The Devourers had established a forward base in the gravitational anomaly at the edge of the Kepler sector, using the distorted spacetime to hide their fleet movements. The auditorium's massive holographic display activated, showing the twisted region of space where normal physics broke down. The Void Rift was a nightmare of gravitational shears and temporal distortions, a place where ships could enter and emerge decades in the past or future, if they emerged at all. Intelligence suggested that the Devourers were using the rift to coordinate simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors, Zekthar continued. Ships would enter the anomaly at different times but emerge in synchronized formation, allowing them to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning. Fleet Admiral Thorne leaned forward slightly, her scarred face intent. She had been a junior officer during that battle, one of the few survivors of the initial reconnaissance mission that had discovered the Devourer base. High Command assembled, a joint task force to investigate and potentially destroy the base, Zekthar said. 12 ships representing 7 species, equipped with the most advanced sensor equipment available. I was assigned as tactical coordinator aboard the human vessel, Indomitable, commanded by Captain Sarah Mitchell. The memory of Captain Mitchell still brought a mixture of admiration and confusion to Zekthar's mind. She had been young for a human commander, barely into her 30s, with an unsettling habit of making critical decisions based on what she called gut instinct rather than tactical analysis. The approach to the rift took 3 days, Zekthar continued. As we got closer, the gravitational effects began interfering with our instruments. Navigation became increasingly unreliable, and several ships reported temporal anomalies in their sensor readings. Standard protocol would have been to establish a safe perimeter and conduct long-range reconnaissance. The holographic display showed the task force's formation as they approached the anomaly. The alien ships maintained precise military formations, their movements coordinated and predictable. The human vessel, however, seemed to weave through space with an almost organic fluidity. Captain Mitchell ordered the Indomitable to take point position, Zekthar said. When I questioned the wisdom of putting our most vulnerable ship in the most dangerous position, she gave me an answer that I didn't understand until much later. She said, "Commander, if this goes wrong, would you rather have humans or aliens responsible for getting everyone home?" The initial probe into the rift had been unlike anything in Zekthar's experience. The space-time distortions played havoc with conventional sensors, but the human crew had adapted with disturbing ease. Instead of relying on instruments, they had begun using biological cues, the behavior of small organisms in the ship's hydroponics bay, the way artificial gravity fluctuated, even the sound of the ship's hull under stress. What we found inside the rift defied every principle of physics I thought I understood, Zekthar said. The Devourer base wasn't just hidden in the anomaly. It was using the gravitational distortions as a weapon. Ships that approached too closely were torn apart by tidal forces or thrown into temporal loops. The discovery had been horrifying in its implications. The Devourers had found a way to weaponize spacetime itself, creating a fortress that was virtually impregnable. Worse, intelligence gathered from captured equipment suggested that they were preparing to replicate the effect in other systems. The task force commander, Admiral Kaveth of the Krathari Defense Corps, ordered immediate withdrawal, Zekthar continued. The tactical assessment was clear. We lacked the technology to assault a position defended by gravitational weapons. The mission parameters called for reconnaissance only. A murmur of anticipation ran through the assembled officers. Everyone knew that the Void Rift base had been destroyed, which meant that someone had ignored those withdrawal orders. Captain Mitchell requested a private communication with Admiral Kaveth, Zekthar said. I was present for that conversation, serving as tactical liaison. The Admiral explained that attacking the base would be suicide, that we needed to return with intelligence and let High Command develop appropriate weapons and tactics. The memory of Captain Mitchell's response still sent chills down Zekthar's spine. The young human officer had listened to the Admiral's tactical assessment with polite attention, then calmly explained why they couldn't leave. She said, "Admiral, with respect, we're not looking at this correctly. You're seeing an impregnable fortress. I'm seeing a weapon that's about to be used against every inhabited world in the galaxy. We can't let that happen." The argument that had followed was a masterclass in human psychology versus alien military doctrine. Admiral Kaveth had presented logical, well-reasoned arguments about preserving forces for future battles and the importance of intelligence gathering. Captain Mitchell had countered with something far more dangerous: moral certainty. Captain Mitchell proposed what she called a demonstration mission, Zekthar continued. She wanted to prove that the Devourer base could be destroyed, even if it meant sacrificing the Indomitable to do it. She argued that the tactical intelligence gained would be worth the loss of a single ship. The holographic display showed the Indomitable separating from the task force, its course taking it directly into the most dangerous region of the rift. The other ships maintained their positions at the edge of the anomaly, their crews watching in a mixture of admiration and horror. "What happened next redefined my understanding of human engineering capabilities," Zekthar said. Instead of attacking the base directly, Captain Mitchell began using the Indomitable as a probe, deliberately triggering the gravitational weapons to map their effects and limitations. The human ship had endured punishment that should have destroyed it within minutes. Gravitational shears had twisted its hull, temporal distortions had aged different sections at different rates, and the crew had dealt with localized gravity fields that changed direction every few seconds. But the humans adapted, Zekthar continued, his voice filled with amazement. They rerouted power systems around damaged sections, manually operated controls when automated systems failed, and somehow maintained ship integrity through what can only be described as engineering improvisation bordering on the miraculous. The breakthrough had come when the human crew had realized that the Devourer base's gravitational weapons were dependent on precise calibration with the natural anomalies of the rift by deliberately introducing chaotic variables, uncontrolled engine burns, random mass ejections, even deliberately damaging their own gravitational systems. They had created interference, patterns that disrupted the weapons. Captain Mitchell opened a communication channel to the task force, Zekthar said. Her ship was barely holding together. Half her crew was unconscious from gravitational stress, and she was personally holding a critical power coupling in place with her bare hands. But she was smiling. The memory of that smile still haunted Zekthar's dreams. Captain Mitchell had looked directly into the camera, her face streaked with coolant fluid and her uniform torn, and delivered a message that had changed the course of the war. She said, "Admiral, I'm transmitting our sensor data now. We've found their weakness. But more importantly, we've proven something that the Devourers need to understand. Humans don't know when to quit." The assault that followed had been a carefully coordinated strike based on the intelligence gathered by the Indomitable. The task force had used the human ship's sacrifice to map the gravitational weapons and identify the precise approach vector needed to reach the base. The Devourer base was destroyed in a single, coordinated assault, Zekthar said, but the real victory wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Word of the battle spread through Devourer space faster than our own intelligence networks could track it. The impact on enemy morale had been devastating. A species that relied on technological superiority and overwhelming force had been defeated by improvisation and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. Captain Mitchell survived the battle, though her ship was a total loss, Zekthar continued. When I asked her how she had maintained crew morale during what was essentially a suicide mission, her answer redefined my understanding of human leadership. Fleet Admiral Thorne nodded slightly, her own memories of that day evident in her expression. She had been a junior engineering officer on the Indomitable, one of the crew members who had manually operated damaged systems under impossible conditions. Captain Mitchell said, "Commander, fear is just information. It tells you that something is dangerous, but it doesn't tell you whether it's possible." My crew wasn't fearless, they were informed. They knew the risks, they understood the stakes, and they chose to accept both. Zekthar turned to face Fleet Admiral Thorne, his 6 eyes meeting her steady G the following week. Zekthar stood before the largest gathering yet assembled at the Academy. Representatives from the Galactic Council had arrived, along with military historians and xenopsychologists from across known space. The venue had been moved to the Academy's main ceremonial hall, its crystalline dome providing a view of the stars where so many of these battles had taken place. "The liberation of Xerion Prime," Zekthar announced, his voice resonating through the vast space. "The bloodiest battle of the war, and the one that taught me the most about what humans call the price of freedom. It was here that I learned the difference between winning a battle and winning a war." The massive holographic display showed the Xerion system, once home to one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. The Xerioni had been philosophers and artists, their crystalline cities reflecting their belief in harmony and peaceful coexistence. The Devourers had turned their homeworld into a fortress and their people into slaves. The Xerioni had been enslaved for 2 years, Zekthar continued. 3 billion beings forced to work in Devourer weapon factories, their children raised as soldiers for the enemy fleet. Intelligence suggested that the Devourers were preparing to repeat this process on dozens of other worlds. A Galactic Council representative, her translator device glowing softly, spoke up. "Commander, the records indicate that High Command considered Xerion Prime to be strategically unimportant. Why did the humans insist on liberation?" Zekthar's mandibles clicked as he remembered the heated debates in the strategic planning sessions. The Galactic Council had presented compelling arguments for bypassing Xerion Prime, focusing instead on military targets that could shorten the war. The humans had listened politely, then announced their intention to liberate the planet with or without support. General Patricia Morrison, commanding the 3rd Human Expeditionary Force, gave the Council a simple ultimatum, Zekthar said. She said, "You can help us save these people, or you can explain to history why you chose not to. Either way, we're going." The holographic display showed the human fleet that had assembled for the liberation attempt. Unlike their previous improvised forces, this was a professional military formation equipped with the hard-won lessons of 2 years of warfare. But the challenge they faced was unprecedented in its complexity. Xerion Prime wasn't just defended, it was fortified using the enslaved population as both labor and human shields, Zekthar explained. The Devourers had integrated the civilian population so thoroughly into their defensive systems that any conventional assault would result in massive civilian casualties. The tactical briefings had been exercises in frustration. Every approach to the planet was covered by defensive installations built into civilian areas. The orbital shipyards were connected to residential districts. The communication centers were located in schools, and the primary military command was housed in what had once been the planet's largest hospital. The solution came from an unexpected source, Zekthar continued. Sergeant Maria Santos, a human special forces operative, had grown up on a colony world that had been evacuated during the early days of the war. She understood something about displaced populations that the rest of us had missed. The memory of Sergeant Santos still brought a smile to Zekthar's features. She had been small even by human standards, with an appearance that could charitably be described as unremarkable. But her mind had worked in ways that had consistently surprised her alien colleagues. Sergeant Santos proposed what she called liberation from within, Zekthar said. Instead of attacking the planet's defenses, she wanted to infiltrate the slave population and organize a coordinated uprising. The tactical challenges were staggering: communication without detection, coordination across multiple species, and timing that would require precision measured in seconds. The plan had been audacious in its scope and terrifying in its reliance on factors beyond military control. Human operatives would infiltrate the planet disguised as captured prisoners, establish contact with resistance cells, and coordinate a planet-wide rebellion timed to coincide with the fleet assault. I was assigned to Sergeant Santos's infiltration team, Zekthar continued. My first experience being inside a Devourer prisoner transport was educational in ways I hadn't expected. The humans had trained for this mission by subjecting themselves to conditions that would have been considered torture by most species. The journey to Xerion Prime had taken 3 weeks in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of a simulated prisoner transport. The human operatives had endured the experience with a combination of grim determination and gallows humor that had both impressed and disturbed their alien teammates. Once on the planet's surface, we discovered that the Zerioni hadn't been passively accepting their enslavement, Zekthar said. They had been preparing for liberation, maintaining communication networks and stockpiling resources despite constant surveillance. They had been waiting for someone to give them hope. The underground resistance network had been a marvel of organization and dedication. Zerioni civilians had maintained their cultural identity and social structures even under the most oppressive conditions, creating a shadow government that was ready to emerge the moment opportunity presented itself. Sergeant Santos's genius was recognizing that liberation couldn't be imposed from outside, Zekthar explained. It had to come from within, supported by external force but driven by the will of the enslaved population itself. She didn't want to rescue the Zerioni. She wanted to help them rescue themselves. The coordination required for the operation had been staggering. Messages had been passed through encoded artistic expressions. Weapons had been smuggled in food shipments, and tactical plans had been disguised as philosophical discussions about pre-war Zerioni literature. The uprising began at exactly 0347 local time, Zekthar said, simultaneously across 16 cities and 47 industrial complexes. The Zerioni didn't just rebel, they demonstrated organizational capabilities that impressed even the humans. The holographic display showed the coordinated strikes that had paralyzed the Devourer occupation force. Slave workers had seized control of weapons factories. Communication technicians had turned planetary defense systems against their former masters, and even children had participated by disrupting surveillance networks. But the most remarkable aspect wasn't the tactical execution, Zekthar continued. It was the moral discipline. Despite years of brutal oppression, the Zerioni had maintained their ethical principles. They captured their oppressors rather than executing them, protected Devourer civilians who had been trapped on the planet, and immediately began establishing democratic governance structures. The human fleet's assault had been perfectly timed to support the planetary uprising. While Devourer forces had been overwhelmed by internal rebellion, the orbital defenses had been systematically dismantled by precisely coordinated strikes that minimized civilian casualties. General Morrison's assault plan was a masterpiece of surgical precision, Zekthar said. Every target was selected not just for military value, but for its symbolic importance to the liberation effort. When the humans destroyed the Devourer command center, they broadcast the explosion to every screen on the planet. The liberation of Zerion Prime had taken 18 hours from start to finish. When the fighting ended, 3 billion people had been freed from slavery. The Devourer Regional Command had been destroyed, and most importantly, a template had been established for liberating other enslaved worlds. The aftermath was as important as the battle itself. Zekthar continued. The humans didn't establish a military occupation or impose their own governmental systems. They helped the Zerioni rebuild their own society, providing resources and protection while respecting their sovereignty. A xenopsychologist from the Andorian Institute raised her hand. Commander, how did this approach differ from standard post-liberation protocols? Zekthar's 6 eyes focused on the questioner. Most species would have established security zones, imposed military law, and gradually transitioned to civilian governance. The humans simply asked the Zerioni what they needed and provided it. No conditions, no political requirements, no cultural impositions. The rebuilding effort had been as impressive as the liberation itself. Human engineers had worked alongside Zerioni architects to restore the planet's cities, while preserving their cultural significance. Medical teams had treated both physical and psychological trauma, while training local personnel to continue the work. 6 months after liberation, Zerion Prime was not only fully functional, but had become a symbol of resistance throughout Devourer space, Zekthar said. Enslaved populations on other worlds had begun organizing their own liberation movements, inspired by proof that freedom was possible. The final gathering filled every available space in the Academy's ceremonial hall and spilled out into the surrounding courtyards through live broadcast feeds. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy had come to hear Zekthar's final story, including several former enemies who had since joined the galactic community. The weight of expectation was almost tangible as he stood before the assembled crowd. The last stand at Terra, Zekthar began, his voice heavy with emotion. The battle that ended the war and began the peace. The day I learned that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their courage in fighting, but their wisdom in knowing when to stop. The holographic display showed Earth itself, the blue-green world that had given birth to humanity. But this wasn't the peaceful planet of tourist videos. This was a world under siege, surrounded by the largest devourer fleet ever assembled. The final gambit of a dying empire, betting everything on breaking the human spirit by destroying their homeworld. By the time the devourers reached the Sol system, they had lost 70% of their territory, Zekthar continued. Their slave rebellions had spread across half the galaxy. Their military had been shattered in a dozen major battles, and their leadership was fracturing under the pressure of constant defeat. The approaching devourer fleet was a sight that still haunted the nightmares of every being who had witnessed it. 10,000 ships of various sizes carrying the remnants of a civilization that had chosen destruction over surrender. Their intent was clear. If they couldn't rule the galaxy, they would eliminate the species that had taught others to resist. The Galactic Defense Force had assembled the largest fleet in recorded history to defend Earth, Zekthar said. Ships from 47 species, veteran crews from every major battle of the war, and enough firepower to reduce a star system to rubble. We were confident that we could stop the devourers before they reached the inner planets. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd as the holographic display showed the massive Allied fleet, positioning itself at the edge of the Sol system. The formation was impressive, over 8,000 ships arranged in defensive lines that should have been impenetrable. What we hadn't anticipated was that the devourers had modified their ships. For this final battle, Zekthar continued, they had stripped away life support systems, removed escape pods, and overloaded their reactors. Every ship in their fleet was essentially a guided missile with enough firepower to crack a planet. The battle that had followed defied every principle of conventional space warfare. The devourers hadn't fought to win. They had fought to inflict maximum casualties before dying. Their ships had rammed Allied vessels when their weapons failed, detonated themselves in proximity to planetary defense stations, and targeted civilian evacuation ships with kamikaze attacks. For the first time in the war, the humans were losing, Zekthar said quietly, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting an enemy that valued destruction more than survival. The Devourer fleet was being decimated, but they were taking Allied ships with them at an unacceptable rate. The memory of that desperate day still brought pain to Zekthar's features. He had watched ships commanded by beings he had served with for years disappear in nuclear fire, their crews dying to protect a world that many of them had never seen. The human crews had fought with desperate determination, but even they had seemed overwhelmed by the scale of the sacrifice being demanded. Admiral Chen, commanding the human home fleet, made a decision that shocked every military strategist in the galaxy. Zekthar continued. With the Devourer fleet still 6 hours from Earth orbit, she ordered all Allied ships to withdraw beyond the orbit of Mars. The auditorium erupted in confused murmurs. Everyone knew that the battle had been won, but the tactical records had always been classified. The idea that the defending fleet had withdrawn seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about the war's conclusion. I was serving as tactical coordinator on Admiral Chen's flagship, Zekthar explained. When I questioned the withdrawal order, she showed me intelligence reports that changed my entire understanding of the battle. The humans had been planning for this scenario for months. The holographic display shifted to show Earth itself, its surface dotted with structures that hadn't appeared in any previous tactical briefings. Massive energy projectors had been built into the planet's surface, connected to power grids that drew from the planet's core itself. It was a defensive system unlike anything ever constructed. The humans had turned their homeworld into a weapon, Zekthar said, but not the kind of weapon anyone expected. Instead of designing systems to destroy the approaching fleet, they had created something far more sophisticated, a containment field that could trap ships in Earth's gravity well without destroying them. The technological achievement was staggering. Human engineers had essentially created a selective gravity field that could distinguish between friendly and hostile vessels, trapping enemy ships while allowing Allied forces to operate freely. But the power requirements were enormous. Maintaining the field would drain Earth's energy reserves completely. Admiral Chen opened a communication channel to the approaching Devourer fleet. Zekthar continued. Not to threaten them or demand surrender, but to make an offer that no one had expected. She offered them sanctuary. The silence in the auditorium was profound as the assembled beings tried to process what they had heard. The idea that humans would offer protection to the very enemy that had come to destroy their homeworld seemed to defy every understanding of human nature. The Admiral's message was simple, Zekthar said. She told the Devourer fleet that Earth's defensive systems could protect them from their own leadership's suicide orders. Any ship that surrendered would be safely captured rather than destroyed, and their crews would be given the opportunity to start new lives rather than dying for a lost cause. The response from the Devourer fleet had been immediate and devastating, not because they had rejected the offer, but because they had been divided by it. The fanatical leadership had ordered continued attack, but thousands of crew members had begun questioning orders that guaranteed their deaths. What followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense, Zekthar explained. It was a massive prisoner rescue operation. Human ships had moved into the Devourer formation, not to attack but to accept surrenders and evacuate crews from ships whose officers refused to stand down. The holographic display showed the chaotic scene that had unfolded as the enemy fleet had essentially dissolved from within. Ships had broken formation to surrender individually. Crews had mutinied against officers who insisted on kamikaze attacks, and in some cases human rescue teams had boarded Devourer vessels to evacuate. Personnel from ships with armed reactors, the containment field activated when the remaining fanatics tried to ram Earth itself. Zekthar continued. Their ships were caught in an energy web that held them in stable orbit, while emergency teams evacuated their crews. Not a single Devourer died in that final battle, not because they weren't dangerous, but because the humans refused to let them. The aftermath had been unprecedented in galactic history. Instead of victory celebrations and war crimes trials, the humans had organized refugee camps and psychological counseling services. Former enemies had been housed, fed, and given opportunities to rebuild their lives on worlds that had volunteered to accept them. I asked Admiral Chen why the humans had chosen mercy over justice, Zekthar said. Her answer redefined my understanding of what victory really means. She said, "Commander, we didn't fight this war to prove we could destroy our enemies. We fought it to prove we could save them." The long-term consequences had been profound. The former Devourer territories had been reorganized into democratic federations, their populations given the opportunity to choose their own governments and cultural directions. Many had requested membership in the Galactic Council, bringing unique perspectives and technologies that had enriched the entire galaxy. The war officially ended not with a surrender ceremony, but with a series of constitutional conventions, Zekthar continued. Former enemies worked alongside former allies to establish new governments, new trade relationships, and new cultural exchanges. The humans insisted that every voice be heard, every species represented, and every world given the right to self-determination. A young cadet from one of the former Devourer species stood up, her translator device glowing as she spoke. "Commander, my grandmother was evacuated from a kamikaze ship during that battle. She always said that humans were the first enemy who taught her people how to surrender with honor." Zekthar's 6 eyes focused on the young officer, seeing in her features the legacy of decisions made in humanity's darkest hour. "Your grandmother was right, cadet. The humans understood something that most species miss. True victory isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about turning them into friends." The commander turned to face the memorial wall one final time, his gaze settling on the human section where so many names were etched in crystal. Each name represented not just a life lost, but a choice made to value others above self.